ready. Okay. Thank you for coming despite heavy rain. And I'm very happy to resume this workshop. And so today we are going to actually talk about, we have four great speakers on the topic of extending boundaries of molecular sciences through machine learning approaches. So we have chemists with different background, and we even have mathematicians as the last speaker to teach us what is all behind of this. And our scheduled first speaker was Mark Zuckerman. He's coming, but he is coming very slowly because of rain, even though he lives quite close to this place. So we switched the order, and our first speaker will be Josh Schreier from Fordham University. And let's thank him again. Okay.
Okay.
Welcome.
Great. Thanks. So yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you for braving the rain. And maybe for the afternoon session, we'll put our efforts towards building an ark so we can get home. So what I'd like to tell you about today is really sort of a two-part story. In the first part, I want to tell you about some of the ways that we've actually been trying to use machine learning in an experimental laboratory setting. And I'll tell you about some of the wins that we have there. The second half is really more of a sermon of what we're not doing well enough, and where I think there are really great opportunities for new research, towards these applications in the laboratory. And so I hope the second half will be thought-provoking, and certainly for the graduate students and the postdocs that are in the audience, that may stimulate some ideas for research projects. And I suppose for everybody else too, but you're the most susceptible to change. And so really, I mean, to motivate this, I know we have one pure mathematician in the audience, who maybe wants to be convinced of why we would want to create new materials in the laboratory. And the way that I like to justify this is that every time humans have come up with a new way of manipulating matter and controlling matter, it's just radically changed our society, right? So, we name these historic ages of human civilization after the materials that people figured out how to control. And of course, in the last century, this has been extended, and there are vast classes of materials, plastics or semiconductors, right? That just radically transform our lives. And so, kind of thinking about the 21st century, I know many people are motivated by this idea of renewable energy or carbon capture. And in every one of these applications, there's an underlying material science problem, right? Where if we had better materials, we could actually address these issues. And so the material that I've been focused on, my toy model, if you will, are these halide perovskite materials. And they're just they're just amazing materials. They're often called the poor man's high performance semiconductor. So just, to kind of get a sense of the overall composition and structure of these, this is the sort of the canonical methyl ammonium lead iodide shown on the left. You can interpret each of the spheres as an atom, and we group the inorganic building units, so the inorganic elements, into these polyhedra, right? So on the vertices of the polyhedra are these halogen atoms, right? For example, iodine, and in the center is a metal, perhaps lead. And in the middle here, we've got an organic molecule, right? So this is a molecule that contains carbon atoms. In this case, it's a methyl ammonium molecule. And we'll just refer to these molecules in the middle as amines. This is a tremendously exciting class of materials. People have used them for lots of applications, including very high performance, but low cost photovoltaic solar cells, but also other things where you might want to have a large area of a high performance semiconductor. So things like light emitting diodes or X-ray detectors are also really great applications. The challenge is that, well, for one, the best performing materials use lead, and we probably don't want to create acres and acres of lead too in the environment. So, maybe we can replace the lead with other elements and still try to keep the performance high. The other issue is that some of these materials have limits on their stability. And so what's neat and kind of what makes this a powerful class of materials is that it's very adaptable, right? And we might be able to change the structure of these simply by changing the organic molecule that we incorporate into the center, right? So for example, here's our methyl ammonium lead iodide. It forms a cubic arrangement of the inorganic building units. But by incorporating a bulkier organic molecule, we can now get two-dimensional planes. And so this is really neat. I mean, essentially, you have a self-assembled quantum well-like structure that you can get just by fiddling with the organic molecule that you incorporate. And for those of you that have taken an organic chemistry class, you also know that there's almost an unlimited family of organic molecules that one could think about incorporating. And there are, by a rough estimate, 1 to 5 million commercially available organic molecules that might be suitable for this type of structure. So that's kind of neat. I mean, just to give you a sense of the structural diversity that's possible by changing these organic building units. So that's great. I mean, it's kind of a rich system that we can explore. Where does machine learning come into this, right? Well, if you want to make a new material, you've got this sort of painstaking process of trying to optimize how do you actually grow this? What's the right recipe, if you will, for developing the system? And so, just kind of as a back of the envelope calculation, you might say, well, I can change the amount of the inorganic precursor, right? I can change the amount of the organic precursor. I can add additives, acid, for example. I can change the nature of the solvent. And then I can change all of the processing conditions that are associated with this. And so, you do some back of the envelope calculation. And for every one of these new materials that we want to explore, there might be 10 million different conditions that you'd want to test. And, for the most part, actually, it's really astounding. Most of the experimental research that is done in this field is essentially just trial and error, right? Or cook and look, as I like to call it, not unlike the alchemists of old. So, what we want to do is really try to apply a sort of a machine learning approach in the lab, right? And think about this, at least at kind of a very basic level, as sort of a classification problem, right? We've got a series of inputs that describe our recipe, concentrations, pH, time, temperature, et cetera. And then we've got some outputs. And perhaps at the very coarsest level, we might just be interested in, will this recipe even produce a product at all, right? Even aside from what that product is, right? And so we could think about that as sort of our output. And then we'll try to use a machine learning approach to find that mapping. And our hope is that then that can accelerate the discovery process. Now, here's the thing. It sounds like an easy problem, but there are actually a lot of challenges in doing this in practice. If you go into the chemical literature, we have a vast collection of conditions that people have tried, and they report how it is that they synthesize the material. But that's a really incomplete data set, right? It only contains one example of a successful reaction and does not include all of the failures along the way, right? And so if you think about trying to train this classifier function that is finding the boundary between successful outcomes and failed outcomes in the lab, well, we just don't have examples in the literature of those failed reactions. And so, in some sense, the data sources are really kind of incomplete. When I started this project, I was very jealous of the astrophysicists because they have such great names, like dark matter, dark energy. So we said, let's call these unreported experimental failures and marginal successes, let's call those the dark reactions, right? But if you think about it, not unlike dark matter, right? The details of these reactions are actually out there. And so what we did is we paid a couple undergraduate students to go through a decade's worth of old laboratory notebooks and digitize the old laboratory notebooks. Because in the laboratory notebooks, we actually do have that complete record of success and failure. Then we had a couple other undergraduate students that built some very simple classification models. And then what we did is we paid a few more undergraduate students to run 500 or 600 experimental reactions in the laboratory to test our model, right? And what we found was that even with this relatively modest data set, I think this was about 3,000 or 4,000 experimental data points, we could build models that were just as good, if not actually better, than the human experts who had been planning the experiments before. So that was really great, right? And of course, the other thing that you get out of this is with this complete data record, you can then try to interrogate what's happening in the model. And again, we just did some very simple things, right? But even something like a decision tree, informs you about some of the underlying, potential hypotheses about what might be happening. So that was really neat. But this actually suggests kind of a challenge for us, right? If we want to use machine learning in an experimental setting, the challenge might not be with the algorithms, right? We can use very simple algorithms, but really thinking about getting appropriate data. The other thing that we found is that even if you had that complete record of experimental data with successes and failures, that might not be good enough for the machine learning task that you wanted to perform. And the way we found this was actually kind of accidentally. I was really intrigued by this idea of generative models, right? In other words, we wanted to have a model that would output what would be reasonable reaction plans. And when I tried building this, I ended up just getting outputs from this generative model that were all the same or all very similar, right? They were just kind of in a narrow parameter region. And at first I thought, well, maybe this is just a bug in the code, right? And I scratched my head over it for a while. And then what I realized is that actually it's a bug in the data, right? So we looked really closely, both at our record of unpublished laboratory notebooks, right, for reaction conditions, but also at published crystal structures, right? And what are the types of reagents that people were using and then ultimately reporting in crystal structures. And what we found is that data set was tremendously biased. There were some reagents and reaction conditions that were just totally overrepresented in the data set, and other things that seemingly should work, but were just totally absent, right, in the published literature or in our unpublished laboratory conditions. And so, what we did is, again, pay a small army of undergraduate students to conduct, 1,000 reactions, where we did things like look for chemical reagents that had never been reported in the structural literature, but that were cheap, right? You could buy them from a chemical supplier, very inexpensively, and actually generated randomly. We created randomly generated experiment plans and then had the students try those, right? To try to find out, what was the kind of interaction, or was there anything special about the reaction conditions that we had kind of observed in the literature? And the answer was no, right? That sort of the popularity in whether it's kind of choices of reaction conditions or the popularity of reagents was totally uncorrelated to the reaction success rate, even if you were just generating random experiment plans. So that was really kind of surprising. The other thing that was actually a little sad was that what we did was that we said, all right, well, suppose that you have this record of human-generated experiment plans and their outcomes, and you use that to train a machine learning model. What if you just had a collection of randomly generated experiment plans? You perform them in the laboratory and find out how they work, and then use that to train a different machine learning model. Which model would perform better? And what we found was that actually the data sets that were just randomly generated experiment plans could actually be much smaller, right? Maybe 20% smaller, and yet you could use those to train machine learning models that gave better predictions in the laboratory by all metrics, right? And we, again, evaluated this by performing a few hundred experiments in the lab. So, this suggested to us that maybe we needed to do something different and address the supply chain, if you will, of experimental data.
So how many randomly generated reactions did you but so relative data start?
Yeah, it was like on the order of 900 to 1,000.
900 to 1,000.
Yeah. So it took a while to have students do all these, right? So
It may still be very small compared to the known reaction.
oh yes, yeah, and I have to say that in this what we were comparing against were a data set of similar types of reactions. In this case, these were hydrothermal synthesis reactions. So we had kind of a similar data set that we could draw upon.
So you have some set of reactants or some kind of criteria that meet all those reactants, but that have not been explored.
That's right. And the way that we tested the models kind of at the end, right, in the lab, was testing them on new organic building units that had never been explored before, either in our work or in the literature, right? And see how the performance would be on those kind of like truly unknown reagents. So yeah, so this was kind of interesting, and so we thought, well, how can we do this better, right? How do we fix these problems? And essentially, the project that we've been working on for the last 5 years is really to address this in 3 ways. First of all, having a small army of students conduct experiments over the course of a year or a year and a half. It's just slow, right? So can we automate the experiments? And so what we developed is actually a way of automating these synthesis reactions, so that now we can do about 100 reactions in 5 hours, right? And so this really kind of increases the rate that we can generate data, but also that we can test algorithms, right? On the side, actually, we also needed a better way of capturing what happens in the laboratory, and also abstracting sort of the interface between our machine learning algorithms that are going to provide a specification of the experiment and the operator in the laboratory and the robot that he is working on, that actually have to do the experiment, and getting the data back to the algorithms as well, right? So we call this the Escalate software. I won't talk about it at all today. What I want to focus on is actually the ways that we've used this system to develop and test kind of machine learning driven experiment planning, right? And so I'll kind of focus on some of those. I said we, right? I mean, we is a very deliberate pronoun choice here, right? So I'm a theoretical physical chemist, and essentially the way that I got into this was that I was somebody that knew enough about computers to be dangerous, and knew enough about chemistry to talk to the chemists, right? But this is really a team effort, right? The experimental chemistry brains of the operation is my former colleague Alexander Norquist at Haverford College, and we actually work very closely with Emery Chan at the Molecular Foundry at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, who is a guru in automation of inorganic chemistry processes, right? And actually some really talented postdocs and software engineers and lab technicians have played a role in this too. So certainly this is a team effort. But here's the robot, right? It's actually in some sense nothing too fancy. It's really just a automated pipetting system. So it just moves liquids from one location to another with microliter precision, right? So and so you can actually see the sort of the reservoirs of our stock solutions over here. What it's going to do is just slurp those up, just like sucking on a straw, and spit them out into vials that are on the left-hand side here. And those vials are actually in a block that we can shake, so we can mix things up, and we can also heat them up as well, right? And then one of the real challenges is then kind of doing something and characterizing these materials, right? So we've come up with 2 different routes, 2 different sort of chemical recipes, if you will. So you could think about these for the non-chemists in the audience. It's like we have one way of making things in the pressure cooker, and we have one way of making things in the air fryer, right? Sort of different routes towards making the same family of compounds. And for the chemists in the audience, there's some really interesting physical chemistry in these. There's a retrograde solubility effect that we can exploit to grow high quality crystals. That is really neat. and then there's sort of another approach based on anti-solvent vapor diffusion. But I think for this audience, I'll just skip over the chemistry because we're all machine learning people. But yeah.
Well, on the previous slide, you had some, when you showed the picture of the robot from Dave, how long did it take to make that robot?
Oh, yeah. So actually, this robot, this guy here, we just bought, right? And so actually, our focus was actually on trying to use commercial off-the-shelf equipment. Actually, the nature of the grant that we had didn't allow us to invest in building too much bespoke material, right? They wanted to see how far we could drive off-the-shelf things. So this is a Hamilton Nimbus. You can buy one for maybe $50,000 to $70,000, depending on how you equip it. So it's really just kind of an off-the-shelf gadget, if you will. What took a long time, however, was figuring out how to adapt the chemistry so that we could run it on this robotic liquid, right? Because there are a lot of things that you don't want to do on robots like these, right? They're really well suited for doing liquid transfer operations, right? And it is possible to do solid dispensing, but it's very, very slow, right? And so that sort of hurts your throughput. So we wanted to come up with chemistries that were all liquid based. The other thing is that the way the pipetting works is there's actually sort of a syringe pump kind of in a manifold up top. And so you can imagine the bad things that happen as you slurp up very corrosive materials, right? And in fact, many of the sort of perovskite syntheses use hydroiodic acid as the kind of the acid. So we also needed to develop chemistries that we could perform that don't involve very strong acids. So we actually found some ways that we can use weak organic acids, right? We use formic acid, which is the organic chemists in the room will say, oh, of course, yeah, formic acid is relatively weak. But yeah, so we had to kind of twiddle with the chemistry, but to have that work. The other limitation too is that because we were using this off-the-shelf robot, there's a limit to how hot we can heat things up. And the sort of operational maximum is about 100 degrees Celsius, right? So one trick is that you can get around this by engineering your solvent choices, right? And so again, there's a kind of a really interesting physical chemistry story there. But what took a while was actually trying to come up with the right chemistries and adapt them to make them usable on these off-the-shelf robots, right? And so the sort of first chemistry that we developed, right? We call it Workflow 1 or Rapid 1. Started with a student of mine at the time, Liana Alves, and I. We essentially just went out to Berkeley Lab one summer and banged on the robot until we could get it to work, and kind of stumbled upon this retrograde solubility effect. The other workflow that we developed was this anti-solvent vapor diffusion, and there were many aspects of that were very robot friendly from the get-go, but we had some other issues with controlling the vapor path and laying these things out. So so I think part of the slowness was not building the gadget, so to speak, but developing a chemistry that was compatible. The other thing actually that was really tricky was figuring out ways to make the characterization keep up with the synthesis. So we can run that first workflow in kind of a scale of about 96 reactions at a time, and it takes 5 hours from start to finish. From the technician goes into the laboratory, makes some stock solutions, loads them into the robot, and then runs everything up and then cleans up at the end, right? It's about 5 hours. The anti-solvent process is slower, right? Because it involves this gradual vapor transfer. So it takes about a day, and we run it on a kind of a smaller scale. But obviously, we can set up many of these reactions in parallel. But the trick was actually coming up with characterization workflows that could keep up with the synthesis rate. And so there too, we had a postdoc that essentially worked, full time on trying to find clever ways of manipulating the samples to pull out these crystals and then do things like powder X-ray diffraction, right, at kind of a high throughput scale. The other thing that we were able to take advantage of at Lawrence Berkeley Lab was also that they do have some automated sort of microplate based microscopes, right? So we can just take a picture, but we can also do absorption and fluorescence spectroscopies on the samples. And again, this is largely off the shelf equipment. The hard labor that the postdocs were engaged in was really trying to figure out ways to make the samples work with the off-the-shelf equipment. Yeah.
So how about temperature? Do they work at the same temperature, or do you control the temperature?
Yeah, so we can actually change the temperature. So on this heating block, it's completely programmable, right? So we can set that to be anywhere from room temperature, just leave it off, to about 100 degrees C. So yeah, so that's again another one of these experimental knobs that we could turn. Yeah. So really, I mean, in some sense, like the robots are neat, and sometimes some audiences really dig the robots and the robot story, but it's actually in some sense just a sideshow, because it's just a means for us to get a larger, higher quality data set that is in some sense born digital already, right? And so we've now got this sort of complete record of all of the experiments that we performed, right? Successful or not. We can drill into the reacting conditions, find out, where was it on the plate? And there are small temperature variations on this heating block. Again, we measured those using infrared thermometry. And we've also got kind of all of the kind of spectral information that we captured, also, tagged with each of the data points. So this, is in some sense the raw material then for taking a machine learning approach. The other thing that we did during the pandemic, I had this wonderful student who just liked hacking on stuff. He said, why do we need to have this $50,000 robot? Most of what we have to do is just dispense liquids in a precise way. So what might we do to actually make this a bit cheaper? And so, essentially during the pandemic, he and I kind of iterated on this. He's the kind of guy that has 3 3D printers at home. And I would send him I'd say, hey, what do you need for parts, right? And I'd send him a box of parts in the mail. And so essentially what we came up with is what we call the Sidekick, right? It's a kind of a very low cost liquid dispensing robot. We finished it just in time for the 4th of July in 2021. So we were very proud to do this demo with a little food coloring. But here's the final product, right? With the 3D printed case. What's really neat is that, for about $700 worth of parts and 3 hours of assembly time, if you know how to solder and how to assemble things, you can build a liquid dispensing robot that has 10 microliter precision. Our trick was that we actually use these medical grade dispensing pumps from a company in Connecticut. And so it's just kind of fun. And so we've kind of described the instructions on how to do this. You can watch this video as it fills in the American flag. But actually what we're really excited about is using this as a tool, not just for research, but also to kind of bring some of these ideas of automation and data handling, even into the general chemistry laboratory. And so this past spring semester, Norquist and I developed a lab that we tested on some Gen Chem students, where we bring the students in. They are trying to measure the solubility constant of lead iodide. And we came up with kind of a neat exercise where they do a few experiments by hand, and you can kind of see the results that are sort of all over the map. But then we actually train the students how to use the fancy commercial liquid handling robot and how to use this little Sidekick. So each student gets to perform not just an experiment in triplicate, right? But they actually get to perform 96 experiments. And now there's a real need for them to learn a little bit of computer programming and data handling to work with this scale of data, right? And so this actually just came out in Journal of Chemical Education, earlier this month. But yeah, so it's kind of fun, right? So actually the take-home message here is also that the automation is not fundamentally hard, right? We can teach a general chemistry student how to safely operate one of these robots. In fact, actually we can teach 7 groups of 2 chemistry students how to do this in a 3-hour lab period. right? So it takes, on the order of, 15 minutes to train the students on how to use it safely. So really, I mean, we see this as kind of a tool for, turning chemistry into more of a data science. Okay. So, I've told you a little bit about the automation, right? That's this kind of hardware stuff. I didn't tell you at all about the software that we developed, but it's kind of in the background. What I want to focus on is actually, applying, now that we've got this kind of larger, high quality data, now that we've got the ability to actually do large scale testing of algorithms, kind of putting this together and testing different algorithms for driving processes in the laboratory, right? And so going back to this general problem, right? Essentially what we want to do is we want to come up with a recipe, right? It's kind of like Iron Chef, right? I'm going to give you a organic amine, right? So here you go. You've got some scallions or something, right? And then what we're going to task the algorithm with doing is coming up with a recipe, right? How much of that amine should be used, the metal and halide sources and precursors, and then quantities and reaction conditions. And we can kind of think of a hierarchy of different reaction outcomes that we want to achieve. This ranges from just very simple thermodynamic properties, like does a crystalline product form at all or not? And so that would be this kind of simple classification task. But then we can also think about trying to optimize for crystal quality and size, long-term stability, or particular optical properties. And ultimately, kind of at the top of this hierarchy is coming up with ways of maybe predicting composition and structure. Within this, actually, it's useful to kind of think about two different types of tasks. I mean, one, which is much easier, is what we just call sort of chemical interpolation, right? I've got a collection of recipes already with the set of ingredients, and I just want to be able to predict how changing the amounts of those ingredients, the quantities of those ingredients, will affect the reaction outcome. But actually, a much harder problem is extrapolation, right? Like I've got a collection of recipes for baking bread and baking cookies with wheat flour, and I want to swap it out for some gluten-free flour, right? And so in this case, the swapping out is really kind of choosing one of a novel organic amine, right? And of course, buried within this is also this sort of optimization with respect to composition and processing conditions and so forth. All right, so that's the kind of the general problem. All of you are experts in machine learning or studiously avoid machine learning. And so, as you know, right, the kind of the standard approach is you have some starting data set. In this case, it would be, reactions that we performed on the past, right, in different various chemical systems. And then, you select a model of your choice, right, and train a model, and then evaluate the quality by making predictions, right? And in this case, what we're going to do is actually evaluate the model by making predictions about things that could happen in the lab, and then have the robot do the things in the lab. And so for this interpolation task, actually, it turns out you don't need a tremendous amount of data, right? So, if you've got, 96 or 100 examples of a particular set of reagents, then you actually can build very decent models for predicting how the reaction outcomes will change if you just change the compositions, at least for that inverse temperature crystallization. The thing that we found is much harder is extrapolating to new reagents. Even with kind of at the time that we did this study in 2020, we had about 10,000 reactions that we had generated. And even with that, we had some limitations in our ability to extrapolate to the reaction conditions that would actually work for a new reagent. Then again, maybe 40% precision is not so bad for this reaction outcome, right? If you can run 100 reactions in 5 hours, and only 40% of them work, well, that's okay, right? You still have quite a number of reactions that work all right. But what we really wanted to do was kind of incorporate the machine learning in sort of a more iterative way. A way to do that, right, is through active learning. So the idea is that we're going to start with some random sample of experimental results. We can train a model based on that small sample of results. And then what we'll do is that we'll quantify the uncertainty that model has about new experiments that could be performed. And based on that quantified uncertainty, we can define an active learning policy, right? We could say, run the experiments, acquire examples of the things that you're most uncertain about, right? That would be a policy that favors exploration. Or alternatively, we could say, I really just want to have the right answer. Do the things that you think have the highest value, right? Will result in the desired outcome. And that would be an exploitation policy. And of course, you can blend these by weighting them in different ways. And so, based on this, you select some new experiments, you perform them in the laboratory, and now with this larger data set, you can kind of repeat this process until you have reached some desired goal, right? So just to kind of show you how this works in the laboratory, we found this really interesting system, right? And what's neat is that just subtle changes in the composition or the blend of solvents that are used will result in forming, in many cases, well, nothing at all, right? But actually, like when you do form a crystalline product, you can form either this yellow phase that has a sort of a one-dimensional arrangement of the inorganic building units, or this red phase that has a two-dimensional arrangement of the inorganic building units. And so this is actually really convenient because it's easy to just characterize what happened, right? You just see whether it's red or yellow. But also like trying to kind of map this out and find out, what are the variables that control this, right? And where exactly is this boundary in this six-dimensional space, is something that would be, just really hard to do through brute experimentation. And so, our approach then was to sort of frame this as an active learning problem, right? We start off by just collecting some initial data set that we can characterize. We create a random forest model for the reaction outcome, and then we can quantify the uncertainty and send new experimental data points, request new experimental data points at those most uncertain regions. And this is actually kind of a strategy that is applicable outside of the laboratory as well. People like Sharon Galazar have used this to try to identify phase boundaries in simulations too. So we were just crazy enough to try it in the lab, right? And so that's kind of the general strategy. Very quickly, actually, what happens is that you converge on sort of models that are good enough over time. And then what you can pull out then is relative feature importances for the different experimental variables. And by selecting out the most important variables, you can then create something that is a relatively simple picture of the boundary between these red and yellow phases. So that's kind of one case study. The thing that we wanted to do after that was really sort of move beyond active learning, right? Because in some sense, in this active learning setup, we essentially think that we're starting with like a tabula rasa every time we have a new experimental system. And so we're not really leveraging all of the sort of past data that we have available. And so what we wanted to try was actually to see how well a meta-learning approach would work. And so the idea here, again, to sort of use the cooking analogy, imagine that you're a very well-trained French chef. You know many recipes that involve butter and cream and so on. You've got lots of skills with sort of working, with the ingredients that you have, and you know many recipes. But then you get a job at a vegan restaurant, right? And now you no longer can use the cream and the butter that you were used to, right? You still have all of that experience, but you've shifted the domain in which you have to apply that experience, right? And it's going to require some initial experimentation, right? Like you're going to have to go into the kitchen and see how these new ingredients work. But ideally, you should be able to do it faster, right? And learn, how to adapt to these new ingredients much more quickly than, an ordinary, untrained cooker of things like me, right? So that's really the idea in meta learning, right? We start off with a collection of historical data, and now we want to develop models that we can apply to sort of a new environment where there's been a domain shift, right? In our chemistry experiments, essentially, like each of these chemical reagents that we deal with, each organic amine, kind of has its own quirks, and we don't really have a kind of a complete description of how all of them work. So that's the domain shift in our problem. But you could think about that as just being like a different ingredient for our French cook. So typically, when you build a machine learning loss function, you might prioritize prediction quality, right? But there's kind of a buried assumption, right? That the set of tasks that you're going to apply this model to in the future are the same, right? Like I'm going to continue cooking with cream and butter and so forth, right? And so kind of there's like a buried assumption, if you will, right? That the training data represents all of the possible types of tasks, in some way that you'll see. And that, to the extent that you maybe learn a representation or introduce particular descriptors, right? That's, essentially what allows you to apply this to the new problems that you encounter. So what we're going to do in meta learning is changes slightly, right? Well, we want to develop a model that prioritizes rapid fine tuning on a very small amount of new data, right? Or kind of a new task, if you will, right? Small amount of data in that new task. And so operationally, the way that we do this is we add an additional loss function term, and it's just our old loss function, but it's the gradient of that loss function with respect to a task change. So we essentially just kind of wrap the whole algorithm in this sort of outer loop where we divide our historical data into different types of tasks, like recipes that involve eggs, recipes that involve butter, recipes that involve cream, right? And then we prioritize training the model that when it just sees like 3 or 4 or 10 new example recipes in that task, can incorporate that data and essentially learn how to learn in an efficient way. We didn't invent this. This is actually an approach, or the approach that we used is a formalism called model agnostic meta learning. It was developed by Chelsea Finn, who's at Stanford now, back in 2017. And there's an active learning variant of this. It's called probabilistic latent something or other. They just wanted to have a cool name and call it platypus. So as far as I can tell, the acronym is just totally made up. But essentially the active learning variant of mammal is called platypus. And so if you have dozed off in the back and you're now suddenly wondering why he's talking about mammals and platypuses, don't worry, you haven't stumbled into a biology talk. It's just a whimsical acronym. Actually, a few people have applied these mammal and platypus and kind of meta learning in chemistry, but just all in computational tasks, right? In drug design and protein design and in metal organic frameworks, right? So we thought that we would be crazy enough to actually try it in the lab. And so here's basically, kind of the schematic, right? So we start off with this pool of historical data. We're going to split it up into tasks. So the tasks are sets of ingredients that we use, right? So we divide it up into tasks. We train this meta model, right? Under this kind of shifting task with the addition of the shifting task loss function. And then when we want to actually use this in the lab, we're going to go and we'll just sample some small amount of new experiments, right? And in fact, actually what we did is that we said, you're only allowed to get 10 new data points in this new kind of system. And now your meta model has to kind of incorporate those and then make predictions going forward. And so what we think is really useful about this is that it's a way in which maybe you don't even need robots, or maybe your typical chemical experimenter doesn't need to have a robot system, right? They can do 10 experiments at a time, and they can leverage these larger pools of data that have been collected on somewhat unrelated, but not completely distant problems, and kind of the large pools of historical data that have been collected on those.
So how did you find the new loss function? Yeah, if you give some more detailed examples of loss function.
Oh yeah. So essentially what we did, the specific loss function that we used in the experimental study was I believe the balanced classification rate. A reason for choosing balanced classification rate is that again, the sad truth is that many of our experiments fail. And so we don't want to develop a model. If we just said accuracy on predicting failure, then a potential problem would be that our model would just say, oh, well, everything is going to fail. And that's really just not useful, right? Yeah. So using something like balanced classification.
I don't actually know the balanced classification rate.
Right. Sure. So essentially, it's a if I am remembering this right, it's the average of the precision and the recall.
Okay.
Right. So in other words, you get penalized for making false claims, whether they are positives or negatives
Mhm.
in the prediction task. But you can use other functions as well, right? You know, kind of another sort of loss function that works well is the Matthews correlation coefficient, right? Which again has this sort of property that if you just make random guesses, even if there's a class imbalance in the outcomes,
Yeah.
that you can't win or you can't cheat the outcome. And then the meta objective is just the gradient of that, whatever loss function you choose, you know, with respect to task changes, right? And operationally, actually, there's sort of a MAML package, so you can use, you know, whatever model you're already using, and it will take care of kind of adding in that extra loop. Yeah, okay, so that's the sort of MAML. Platypus essentially just kind of adds an active learning loop, right? So we start with, you know, small amount of new experimental data, like 10 data points. You know, we'll update the model, but then we'll quantify the uncertainty of the model for new experiments. You know, identify an experiment that we'd like to perform, right? And then, you know, sort of perform that experiment in the laboratory. You know, again, just performing a few cycles of this, updating the model each time, and then ultimately make some predictions in the lab, right? So essentially, you know, like I said, I mean, I think the thing that we were excited about on this was using this as a way to emphasize small data, right? So, you know, when we come to a new system, we don't want to perform more than 20 experiments, right? So we'll start off with 10 initial experiments, just selected at random, and then, you know, perform, you know, 10 cycles of kind of active learning selected experiments. And, you know, the idea is that then, you know, this is a way that you could, you know, sort of take advantage of these existing synthesis data sets that we've made, even if you didn't have automation. Now, in practice, actually, we use the automation to do this because we wanted to test different models at the same time. So, you know, just to have a more head-to-head comparison. And we evaluated a whole bunch of different things, right? Baseline models without active learning and active learning variants of those baseline models, MAML, right? This meta-learning approach, and sort of the active meta-learning approach of Platypus. And, you know, we just explored lots of different variations. You know, we did a whole bunch of historical back testing because we had this pool of data set. But ultimately, you know, the end goal was that we wanted to test the algorithms in a real lab setting, right? So we looked at, you know, 4 new chemical systems, 4 sets of ingredients that we had never explored before, and are just not present in that historical data. We repeated it 2 times, right? And, you know, perform 10 initial random experiments, and then, you know, 10 iterative experiments where the model is requesting what new experiments to perform, and then, you know, we do them and we feed that in to the system. And, you know, one of the reasons why we want to do this is that, you know, there's always some experimental noise too, right? So we wanted to see how robust this would be in the presence of that experimental noise. And, you know, I guess I wouldn't be telling you about this if it didn't work well. Actually, it turned out that it worked really well in the lab setting. And if you allow the sort of Platypus model to freely choose possible experiments, it was never worse than any other algorithm that we looked at, but it was often significantly better at its ability to predict new reactions after this limited number of experiments. So we thought that was just really kind of fun and exciting. But then we said, you know, we've had so much fun in this project. Why don't we just open it up to other people as well, right? And so we ran, you know, essentially a bake-off competition. We called it the Perovskite Challenge. We invited external teams to submit their algorithms, right? And essentially drive the robots by remote control. And so, you know, the experiments were performed, you know, either at Berkeley Lab or at Haverford College, where we had the robots. We got experiment plans from a variety of people, some folks at MIT, us, some friends in the statistics department at Columbia. There were a couple, you know, kind of companies that were contributing things, including one company in Switzerland, right, that does, you know, sort of chemistry experiment planning software. And so, you know, these teams contributed to the experiment plans, and the Texas Advanced Computing Center gave us compute time to allow people to crunch their models, right? So essentially, everyone was competing against the same game that I told you about with the Platypus paper, right? So we've got 4 different organic reagents that they've got to explore, and you get 2 trials each. Everyone starts with the same historical data and 10 new randomly selected experiments. that we acquired. And then every competitor gets to specify 10 new experiments. Actually, and they specify them one at a time, right? So they can say, hey, I really want to learn about this set of reaction conditions. Go into the lab and tell me what that set of reaction conditions will be, right? And so everybody gets to do that. And then finally, they make predictions about the best outcome, and we test those in the laboratory as well. And really, I mean, actually, it's kind of a neat study. It's out on the ChemArchive, so you can kind of read more about it. What we found is that actually, there are lots of ways that you can define what's the best. So we don't say anyone was a clear winner by all metrics, but certainly a thing that is really important is reliability, right? So you don't want to have a particular choice of reagents where your method just totally fails, right? So you shouldn't just ever totally fail on something, but also, things that can cause you to potentially fail might be, starting with an initial, a different set of these initial randomly selected experiments, right? So that kind of where do you start in that cold start, right? And then how good is your prediction quality? In general, what we found is that actually the sort of Gaussian process type methods and kind of Bayesian additive regression trees, were really, sort of the most robust in that sense. And we also tried to look at like the role of side information about chemical properties in historical data, but that's maybe a longer story. A thing that we found, however, is that many of the active learning algorithms tended to get trapped in local minima, right? So, they get some kind of an initial success, and then they just say, hey, I really don't, I don't think I need to explore other ranges of the experimental parameters. And so one of the things that we did in this paper is that we then actually repeated this process, but we kind of tested an approach that essentially forces the recommendations to be distinct from things in the historical data set and distinct from things that they've tried before, right? So it's just sort of like pushes the results apart. And that remedies some of this possible failure modes of being trapped in local minima. So that was kind of neat, right? Finally, I guess, we've also had so much fun with this. So the perovskite challenge is over. To be honest, the grant is over, so we ran out of money. And, we won't run it again soon, right? But we had so much fun on this that we thought, it would be nice for us to kind of like allow other people to continue playing and testing their algorithmic choices on this data set. And so, in collaboration with our friends at the University of Toronto, Alana Spurguzik, his group has developed this sort of benchmarking package for different experimental planning algorithms. And it also comes with example data that you can use, right? So it's sort of like a gym for this sort of experimental planning. And so we've incorporated this perovskite data into the latest version of Olympus, so other people can, at least run a simulated version of the competition problem. But, if you're not interested in perovskites, well, you clearly don't have good taste, but all right, their tastes vary. There are lots of other types of experimental problems, including organic chemistry reactions and nanoparticle growth and so on. Right? So, essentially just kind of getting this out there. So I think that's really kind of the first part of the talk, right? Like, sort of things that we've tried to deploy in the laboratory. For the real pros in machine learning, these have all been kind of finger painting methods, right? The data sets that we have are large by experimental standards, right? They're 10,000 reactions, but that's still sort of small data, right? For many things. But we've gotten a lot of mileage and kind of a lot of practical value for these exploratory chemists in using these kind of relatively simple approaches. And it's really sort of sped up the discovery process. So maybe this is a good time to pause and ask for a few questions, and then I'll launch into the sermon on why we think this is not good enough. Yeah.
What is the criterion for success?
Oh yeah. So that's an excellent question. We kind of think about and unfortunately, well, we might have to go back quite a few slides. So I'll just tell you in words. We sort of think about a hierarchy of reaction outcomes, right? At the base of that hierarchy is, did we actually even produce a product at all, right? And so in this experiment, we were really just looking at that basic level of the hierarchy, right? Like under this set of reaction conditions, can we even make a perovskite crystal, right? But building up on top of that, you might say, well, did I make the right phase? And we saw an example of that in the sort of red and yellow crystal outcomes, right? It's like I could potentially make two different products. Which one am I going to make, right? And can I actually steer the reaction to generate one or the other in a reliable way? Some other work that we've done has also looked at, trying to come up with ways of targeting, kind of specific types of compositions or specific dimensionalities. And there too, you could imagine that there are certain reagents, certain ingredients that you could choose that might have the possibility of forming different dimensional structures, 2D versus 1D versus 0D structures. And then you might be able to change the reaction conditions in order to access just one of those phases or the other phase. But for the bake-off competition, we actually just did the easiest thing, which was, can you even make anything at all, right? And with the additional caveat that it also has to be like a single crystal product, so it's not oh yeah.
I'm just curious, this perovskite, like, what's the idea behind having this organic molecule? It's like a chemistry, not a machine learning.
Yeah. So
Someone that doesn't know any chemistry.
right. Okay. So really, if you think about it, the organic molecules kind of act. I mean, a lot of the functional properties of these materials come from the inorganic building units, right? So most of the charge conduction and light absorption is all taking place in the inorganic building units. What the organic building units do is they essentially serve, one thing that they do is they serve as a template, right? So they, in some sense, organize and structure the inorganic building units in space. And so, one of the things that can really change your electronic properties is, twists of the inorganic building units, twists of those polyhedra relative to one another. And so by using different organic building units, you can essentially control that twist, right? Or you can control the organization of the inorganic building units, right? So you could get things that look like three-dimensional connectivities of the inorganic building units, right? Particle in 3D, right? Versus two-dimensional arrangements of the building units, right? Particle in a quantum well, right? Or one-dimensional arrangements of the inorganic building units, and essentially get sort of like nanowire type of, or clusters, right? 0D clusters of the inorganics are also possible. There is also, there is some interesting photophysics in these as well too. So it is also possible to have various forms of energy transfer, singlet, triplet energy transfers between the inorganic layers and the organic building. And so there are some people like Nienhuis at Florida State who have been trying to figure that out and probe that. And Sergei Tretiak at Los Alamos, has also done a lot of interesting theoretical work on trying to figure that out. But at least at the courses level, really we're just using the organics to arrange the inorganics and get that sort of diversity of structures. But changing those structures then radically changes the optical effects and conductivity and the stability too.
And in your picture, it was really, you had it pictured as floating. Is it really floating, or is it somehow?
The actual sort of crystals that we observe.
No, the inorganic molecule.
Oh yeah, so that's actually another thing that is really neat and goofy about these materials, right? So if you take methyl ammonium lead iodide, right, that kind of cubic structure that I showed way back when at the beginning of the talk, right? You've got this little methyl ammonium cation, right, positively charged molecule sitting inside the center of this cage. And in fact, actually, if you if you look closely, right, by doing a simulation, or there's also experimental evidence, that methyl ammonium actually spins freely inside of this little cage that's formed, which is really kind of cool and neat. With the larger organic molecules, they're somewhat more fixed in space. Obviously they're sort of wiggling and jiggling as the bonds vibrate, but they don't have that free rotation that you have in methyl ammonium. right? Those are really kind of like two extremes of behavior so I guess the short answer to your question is, in the case of methyl ammonium, yeah, it's really just kind of floating freely. I mean, it does have some electrostatic interactions with the surrounding units. But it's also, in some sense, like kind of moving freely, like rotating freely inside its state. But the long answer is no, right? Because it actually depends on which organic species you have. But yeah, there are also really subtle interactions, hydrogen bonding and so on that are related to this structuring effect, but then also shift the optical properties that you see. So kind of a rich system to explore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so follow-up question on follow-up slides. So I guess your kind of the final goal is to get the right structure and also the kind of the simple optical properties.
That's right.
But you're not really trying to understand and control the external dynamics or charge separation that are critical for those.
Yeah, not yet, right? I mean, so I think our first goal was just, can we even make it at all?
I see, okay.
Right. But actually, one thing that I didn't show, and kind of one of the other characterizations that we do, I mean, I guess I showed very briefly the kind of absorption and photoluminescence measurements that we can do at scale. So we do have a kind of a data set on that.
Mhm.
We also built an accelerated sample aging chamber. It's sort of like, I like to joke, it's like Singapore in the summertime. So it's like 80 degrees Celsius, 85% relative humidity, and 1.5 suns of light shining on the samples. That we essentially use to watch the degradation kinetics, because that's kind of another property that you might want to optimize.
Yeah, I think it's important because all those things actually kind of become unstable.
Yeah.
In ambient environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of glossed over that, but to be honest, like most of these demonstrations that we've done have really just been, can I even make it at all? Right. And then, once we make it, then we can actually measure some of these properties or ship samples out to folks. The photophysics one is really neat. I mean, Sergei Tretiak had this neat prediction about this sort of singlet triplet energy transfer between the inorganic layers.
Okay.
And essentially what we said is, hey, wait a minute, we can buy the reagents that he needs. This is a crystal structure that had never been reported, right? A compound that had never been made. But we said, hey, wait a minute, we can do a database search. We can buy just off the shelf the reagents that we need. And so we ran it through the robot and made some samples. We sent it off to an experimental collaborator, but she has just ghosted us. So I guess, we're waiting for the experimental confirmation of the results. But that's maybe another way that we can have sort of a dialogue with theory, particularly on the photophysics. Cool. All right. So yeah.
When you say there's a machine learning algorithm, for instance, the example with when you have the orange and the yellow. So what are the input variables? How do you get them? What algorithm do you use in the machine learning?
Sure, right.
What are the output variables?
Yeah. So yeah, great question, right? So just taking that particular example. Right. Yeah. Let's just go back, right? So we've done lots of different things, right? In this example, right, the input variables there's 6 input variables, 6 raw variables, right? Which are essentially to describe the solvent composition, right? So there are 3 different solvents that are present. The concentration of the organic, concentration of the inorganic, and formic acid, right, which is also present as sort of an additive in this. So
temperature is the same.
And we kept the temperature the same, just for the purposes of simplicity, right? The particular algorithm we used in this study was just a simple random forest algorithm. And the idea there was that, we have relatively small data, right? We're testing this now in a case where we start off with just 24 experiments, right? In a batch, right? So, in some sense, the least bad thing that we could do was use a relatively simple model. So we chose random forests, in part, they're pretty bulletproof for these sort of tabular data type problems. And, also give us, sort of a rough measure of uncertainty that we can use to do this sort of. So we've used kind of lots of different types of algorithms, and particularly in that bake-off, there's a variety of different algorithms that have been tested, from, very simple things like random forests and, Gaussian process regression, to things like, there's these sort of Bayesian additive regression tree approaches, which are fun, right? So I mean, in some sense, like we just wanted to use this as a test bed for testing different algorithms, but for the most part, they're actually sort of relatively.
And the output is,
And the output in this case was does nothing happen, right? In other words, is this just kind of a reaction that fails to do anything, right? Is it a reaction that just results in reprecipitating out the starting materials, right? So in other words, like you make a product, but your product is just things that you started out with, right? Did you make the red phase, right? Or did you make the yellow phase, right? So sort of a fourfold outcome in this case. Yeah. So yeah, again, like simple stuff, right? But it really kind of adds a lot of value for the experimenters.
In a sense, it's really surprising that with such a small number of data, it works.
Yeah.
Is it because you're smart enough to choose the right approach, or do you think there are some genetic, hidden reality?
Right. Well, a value here is like we start with 24 experiments, but then we have a kind of a relatively poor description of what the output is. And then based on where we think we could improve the model, we'll do another 24 experiments and another 24 experiments and another 24 experiments. So, I mean, I think really the kind of the thing that we observed was that, the model starts off okay, right? But it can get better over time. And in the span of 5 or 6 of these cycles, right, then you have some confidence about what the outcomes will be. Again, kind of not perfect, right? Maybe like 85% accuracy, right? 90% accuracy. But that's good. Again, that's good enough, right? If you're performing 24 experiments in a batch and 90% of them do what you think they should do. That's good enough, right? You only need one big crystal in order to then do subsequent properties. All right, cool. So that's neat, right? I mean, I guess all this stuff really helps in the lab, or it potentially can help people in the lab. Actually, we're kind of wrapping up the perovskite project for now. But essentially, kind of ongoing projects are to apply the same set of relatively simple ideas to problems in rare earth element separation and in liposomes, right? And kind of like studying how fatty acids assemble into kind of protocell-like structures. I guess with that, I want to go beyond, right? And this is, I suppose, the sermon part of the talk. Actually, this is a perspective that just came out in JAX yesterday. So this is really fresh off the press, right? But sort of building on what we saw, those problems in some sense were kind of easy, right? And I think you really put your finger on it, right? That there's something like we didn't need a tremendous amount of data, and we could kind of quickly optimize this chemical system. And so I guess what we were trying to think about is, there are many problems like this in chemistry, and this adds tremendous value. But in some sense, it seems like there should also be harder problems that are out there. And the sort of harder problems are what we call exceptional materials, right? So an exceptional material might be one where you have extraordinary or extreme properties, right? Like a super hard material or a room temperature and pressure superconductor, for example. And maybe you have extraordinary properties, or maybe you just achieve this with a very unexpected composition, right? Like if you sort of made kind of a new type of superconductor that used different elements. And really, I mean, I think the thing that we wanted to try to focus on are things that are sort of unpredicted surprises in the discovery process, right? And so we actually looked at 2 case studies, 2 historical case studies looking at kind of high TC superconductors, right? And the sort of discovery of super hard materials. And what can make these materials exceptional, right? Could be the composition. It could be just an extraordinarily low or high value of a single property, But often the things that we're interested in for technology are having like contraindicated extreme properties, right? So if you think about, for example, thermoelectrics, you want to have high electrical conductivity and low thermal conductivity. But you know, the Wiedemann-Franz law that you learned in Intro to Solid State Physics tells you that those things, you know, should be directly correlated, at least for kind of ordinary metals, right? So you kind of have to break that contraindicated property. You know, is this type of surprise actually still possible, right? Like maybe humans have like done all the solid state reactions that need to be done. And I think the answer that you could say is no, right? So even if you just think about simple inorganic compounds, right? Like ternary, quaternary, humans have done many of the ternary compounds, right? Pick 3 elements on the periodic table and make a compound out of them. But we barely scratched the surface on even like quaternary compounds. And then you say, well, why stop there? What about the 5 area, 6 area, and so on compounds? And there, humans have really just kind of barely scratched the surface. And so, you know, you can kind of look at this in different ways. You can look at experimental databases and try to see like the number of materials that are reported in those experimental outcomes, right? The ICSD or HTEM, and kind of look at the growth over time. You can also look at computational databases, things like the Materials Project, where people have tried to use density functional theory calculations to compute hypothetical compositions. And there too, you know, it doesn't look like they're running out of steam, right? Like the number of compounds in these databases just keeps growing on this logarithmic scale. You know, the other thing is you might say, well, we haven't made all of the compounds that we could make, but maybe we've made enough that we can, you know, fill in the, you know, it's not hard to fill in the gaps, right? Like in other words, we could just interpolate. And there too, you know, even if you look at things like, you know, the crystallographic space group, so the structure of the compound, and the atomic number of things that are present, and the oxidation state of kind of the metals that are present, there are just kind of big gaps in these data sets. Again, whether you look at experimental or computational data sets, and even for things as simple as quaternary inorganic compounds, where you're just picking 4 elements in your compound. So, you know, there's plenty of room for surprise and exploration. You know, how have exceptional materials been discovered in the past? Mostly just luck, right? So we really tried to dig in to sort of the history of how people have discovered, you know, and kind of exploited high TC superconductivity, and also kind of the discovery of superhard materials. And in particular, looked at ways in which people have, you know, either tried to use machine learning to drive this approach or have looked retrospectively, right? And said, you know, pretend that I knew nothing about cuprate superconductors, but could I use machine learning on sort of the sort of pre-cuprate, you know, ECS theory superconductors to make predictions? And essentially what we found is that, you know, sort of applying the standard box of tricks of machine learning strategies would not have discovered high TC cuprates, right? And in fact, there are some previous machine learning papers by various folks that actually kind of made that statement for us, right? And similarly, our co-author, Jacob Brugoch, has been trying to use machine learning to look for super hard materials, at least for the past 5 years, and hasn't hit any home runs. You know, getting to the point that was raised about these problems, right? I mean, I think actually a lot of, you know, there's a tremendous number of cases of people using machine learning in an experimental setting in chemistry, right? I told you about a few that we've done, but, you know, there are many, many others. The thing I think that we observe, right, is that actually many of these problems are kind of easy landscapes, right? You know, in other words, you know, they're sort of response functions that are more or less continuous, they're more or less smooth. They maybe just have a few basins of optima. And so then it's kind of very easy to learn a function that describes those input-output relations, and then use very simple algorithms, like even just gradient descent or something, to kind of find those experimental optima, right? And you know, you can extend this to combinatorial problems as well. But you know, actually, and another thing you can do is, you know, not just rely on our gut sense of this being the case, but you can also look at kind of other experimental machine learning data sets and try to see through dimensionality reduction. How many variables actually describe these experiments? And it tends to be that they're described by kind of a relatively small and low dimensional latent space. So that's kind of, I mean, that's just kind of a neat observation. Again, an observation that other people have made in the past, right? So, what we find then is that actually, for these exceptional materials, there are often landscapes that are really unfriendly for optimization. So this is actually a plot of the materials that have a negative Poisson's ratio. So in other words, when you pull on them, instead of getting skinnier, they get fatter, right? So, what are materials that have a negative Poisson ratio in the materials project? And how does that relate to other properties, right? And essentially, what you find is that high performance is pretty rare. It's a pretty discontinuous response function of the kind of that target property, and there's usually these kind of disconnected basins in that response function. So it's just kind of harder to do an optimization on that, and it's harder to just model what the response function would be. So, I mean, I guess what I want to say is, the first part of the talk was telling you about easy stuff, and simple things work really well at the easy stuff. And it's actually tremendously valuable for, your sort of bench chemist, right? Who's trying to fumble their way to discover a new material. But, I guess, there's sort of a different problem that we want to try to solve if we want to find something that is really exceptional, right? I also kind of spent the first part of the talk telling you about how robots help us, right? And it turns out that just brute forcing things is probably not enough for problems like this, right? So you can think about this as kind of being like a collection of Bernoulli trials, right? So there's some very small probability of success. And certainly you could use automation, whether it's of things in the lab or computations to increase N. Maybe machine learning helps you increase P. Sequential learning approaches like active learning maybe change dp/dt. But essentially you can come to a conclusion that just brute forcing the problem isn't going to get you to where you need to be, right? So yeah, and there's some bottlenecks. So what we tried to do was actually think about 6 different research agendas, right? Or 6 different research directions that maybe need some more investigation. So I don't think we have answers for any of these things, but what we tried to do was kind of think about what might be paths towards a machine learning for exceptional materials. And then what's been done in some sense within these paths, right? Like what can we gather as the state of the field? Often drawing on, very disparate things from, evolutionary methods to, game playing and so on. And so these were sort of our rough directions. And I guess I should say that like each of these probably has like a dozen PhD projects, buried underneath. But, kind of very simply, I mean, kind of one thing that might be actually kind of really easy to do is, just avoid focusing on kind of the average behavior, right? If we want to focus on exceptional materials, we don't want to use average performance metrics, right? Like accuracy or R squared, right? The training data that we have available is mostly things, from the boring part of the distribution, and we'll get great metrics on those, but we won't actually predict the things at the extremes, right? And so there are kind of a number of strategies that you can use, right, to address this. They might be as simple as just using different loss functions that emphasize the extremes. People do this in finance all the time because they don't want to lose all their money when extreme things happen in the market. But there might also be kind of difference in different types of algorithms. So a lot of these kind of experimental optimization problems look like bandit problems. You kind of might think about reformulating the way that you structure the bandit problem. And there's some examples in chemistry of that. And similarly, there are kind of approaches for Bayesian optimization that focus on output weighting and so on. The other thing that might be important is maybe you just don't need very good machine learning models, right? In fact, actually, maybe the most useful thing is just a model that points you qualitatively in the right direction to the goal, rather than one that is actually, kind of has very high accuracy, right? And in general, right, in the early stages of our experimentation, we often have just a small amount of data. 5 minutes, great. Amen. What we argue for instead is emphasizing simple models that extrapolate imperfectly from some small data, right? And this might look like physics-informed machine learning. I was counting on having Mark's talk before this so we could point to his talk, but maybe it's an advertisement for that. Methods of symbolic regression. There's actually some neat empirical studies that people have tried in the domain of chemistry of, actually showing that even simple things like feature selection plus building linear models seems to work really well for finding extreme properties of materials in the lab, right? I guess we have some stories on this, but in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. But really kind of thinking about different types of algorithms that focus on this. Another thing that you might do is just try to sample what you can make, right? And forget about optimization. So this is really kind of Herbert Simon's idea of satisficing. And again, there are kind of different ways that you can incorporate synthesizability constraints, whether it's thermochemistry, computed in some way, or synthetic paths into generative models, right? And so there are many examples of this that we talk about. You might also just try to look for unexpected things, right? I think the classic approach is to minimize experimental variance, but maybe you actually want to have experiments that are deliberately sloppy. But if you combine those deliberately sloppy experiments with a complete data capture, then you might be able to pull out interesting new research directions, right? We actually have an example of this in our own work, where essentially, we ran the robots. We didn't control the humidity in the lab. And so there were these big humidity fluctuations that you observed over the course of 18 months. And so essentially what we could do is look for discrepancies where we ran similar reactions on a low humidity day, on a high humidity day, and they ended up with different outcomes. And then, what you can do is again, just using kind of like a simple statistical model, you can prioritize, which ones are kind of effects that might be easier to observe, and then just use the robot to run deliberate controlled experiments that then test those hypotheses, right? So we call that automated serendipity. So that's certainly another approach. You can also try to identify the blank spaces in input and output. We'll skip over that. And I think a lot of people are interested in interpretability and understanding. Maybe for these discovery problems, a magic oracle is just fine, right? And you could pick your favorite magic oracle, whether it's an LLM or whatnot. But knowledge of causes is also useful, and there's a bag of tricks for doing that too. So I think with that, I'll just stop, right? There are a lot of these sort of science and engineering projects that require trial and error. Maybe this sort of data-enabled approach lets us do it faster and better. Experimental data will always be small, right? And noisy and bad in various ways. But even kind of given those limitations, I think we've demonstrated the ability to kind of automate the experiments, collect data at scale, do some interesting science, and really just kind of use these types of tools to increase the chances of success in the lab. There's lots of work to be done on exceptional materials. So I think I'll just stop there. I'll leave this slide up, but particularly for the students in the room that are maybe interested in this intersection between machine learning and experimental chemistry. There's a review that I wrote with some folks, right, that kind of describes the state of things and some research directions at the top. And actually, I contributed a chapter to this new book that will be coming out later this year on methods and applications of autonomous experimentation. Marcus Nowak is actually an applied mathematician at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, but it really covers the fundamentals and applications in a wide variety of science domains, including things like botany, and how might you use automation and help to improve, botanical problems. So that'll be a really fun book. And finally, if you like this type of science at the intersection of chemistry and materials and data, I want to tell you about a great new open access journal from the Royal Society of Chemistry called Digital Discovery. And one of the things that is really neat, in addition to kind of focusing on problems like this, is that we almost always require that all coded data be made public. There are a few exceptions that can be granted. But one of the things that we do in the review process is we have a dedicated data and code reviewer that actually reviews the data and code and sees, does it make sense? Can somebody else run this? And so particularly for the postdocs that are in the audience, if you'd like to be a data and code reviewer, please shoot me an email and we'll add you to the list, and you'll be entered to win a mug from the Royal Society of Chemistry. But more importantly, you'll really kind of get a chance to help shape the development of this field and make sure that people are sharing all of their data and code in a way that is usable by the broad community. So now I think I'm totally out of time, so I'll just stop right there.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two quick questions.
we took a bunch of questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
take some time.
Yeah.
So let's thank him again, then, so we'll have a short, bathroom break and also coffee. And in the meantime, I can set up, your presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Still raining. Yeah, still raining.
It's still raining?
Yeah.
Oh.
I guess it's
Hard?
What?
Hard or light?
No, not less, yeah, I mean, actually less than in the morning, but I don't know, yeah.
The governor has declared a state of emergency in New York.
In the whole state?
No, in the city.
Oh,
In the city,
Yeah,
okay.
but it's not flashlight.
So is it dangerous out there? I think.
I don't know, I guess you can't swim.
But yeah, actually I mean, my son lives downtown and then he said that he was going to swim. Jokingly. Okay, so are you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm happy to announce our last speaker. Actually, kind of special guest for our workshop. So he's John Taylor from Queens College and also the Graduate Center. He's a mathematician and has been working a lot on machine learning and also worked on important things on things related to quantum dynamics in general. And he's talking about tensor networks. Actually, this is different from what he originally suggested, but I was very interested in this and then asked him to talk about this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sugi. Thank you for the invitation and for all the great talks today. I really learned a lot. So what I wanted to do is give a mathematical perspective on these tensor network methods in machine learning. So let me just begin in a very simple way and say the obvious, well, what the goal is. And the goal is we're trying to learn a function that's defined on some very large set, which I'm calling X here. And there's some rules involved. So more specifically, you usually don't have the function, let's say psi, that you're looking for, but you have some sort of empirical approximation for it, which I'm calling psi hat. And then you're not going to look for all possible functions on X, but you're going to specify a particular model class. It may be a particular kind of neural network like we saw in the previous talk, or it could be some other kind of model class. And then you want to find the function in that model class that's closest to the one that you're empirically given. So a good example to have in mind is generative sequence modeling. What I'll be saying is a little bit more general than this, but I think this is a good example. So suppose your set X is a set of sequences. So say fixed length sequences of elements from some alphabet A. And then you may have a probability distribution on all of these sequences. So that'll be a function that gives each sequence its probability of occurring. And then typically you might draw a set of samples from that probability distribution. The samples that you draw won't define the probability distribution, but they'll define some empirical distribution, which you could think of as pi hat. And then you want to specify a model class and try and find the distribution that's closest to pi hat. So one example you might have is A might be an alphabet, like 26 characters or 256 Unicode characters. And the sequence length could be pieces of text that you sample from, Wikipedia or the web or something, and you're trying to make some sort of language model that is going to tell you the probability of any sequence occurring. And then if it's a generative model and you get a probability distribution, maybe you can sample from it depending on your model class. And yes.
So in general, are we looking for something that is closest or close enough given absolute?
Well, so I think what you typically look for is you try to get close to pi hat, but pi hat isn't what you really want. You really want the probability distribution pi. So ideally you choose a model class that has some capacity for generalization. And these are sort of the basic considerations in machine learning that I wasn't going to, go into too much detail about. But the idea is if you get pi hat exactly, then you're just going to reproduce the set of samples that you had, and you're not going to actually be able to generalize. So you don't want to really get pi hat exactly, but you hope that pi hat is outside of your model class, but maybe the best thing that models pi hat within your model class is closer to the actual distribution you're interested in. So that's sort of the thinking.
And any sort of certification guarantees are out of scope?
Well, no, I'm going to give you some guarantees later in this talk. So, okay, but this is a picture to have in mind. Now, let me just say a few mathematical statements. If you take any finite set X, the vector space defined by taking all the functions on X. So I'm denoting that by R raised to the X. That notation just means all the functions from X into the reals. That's a Hilbert space. So for mathematically minded people, this is the free R module on the set X. And as a free object, you have a map from X into this free vector space. And I like this notation that comes from physics of this Bra and Ket notation, because it reminds you that you've got an inner product around. So if you have an element in your set, little x, you can put this vertical line on the left and this right angle on the right to distinguish it from its image in the vector space. And then the inner product is declared by saying that this image of the elements in your set X, which are the basis for your functions, are an orthonormal basis. Okay. Now, when X is a set of sequences, say of length capital N from an alphabet A, so X is A, the nth Cartesian product of A, the free vector space on X decomposes as the tensor product of the free vector spaces on the alphabet. And I think this correspondence between this large Hilbert space and its decomposition as a tensor product of smaller vector spaces, shows up in this notation. So a sequence like A1 through AN is an element of X, and that labels a basis vector in the set X. A1 is one character, and so that's a vector in the vector space V. And you can take the tensor product of those pieces. Okay. For those of you that are in physics, this is surely review.
What do you mean by V vector space compared to vector space?
The free vector space is just a vector space. The freeness refers to it's the free vector space on the set X. So it's the one that you generate all linear combinations of elements in your set X freely without imposing any relations. Okay, the dimensions are large. So even if your alphabet is simple, like 0, 1, and you're looking at bit strings of length 1000, this is a set with 2 to the 1000 elements. And, you know, in some of the previous talks, people made comparative remarks about how much storage has ever been created or something. I think this number far exceeds the number of particles in the universe. And so you're not going to be able to really store in the straightforward way any sort of function from this. So by what mechanism are we going to, you know, restrict the number of parameters to describe functions that have 2 to the 1000 inputs? Well, I think the example to first think in mind is of matrix factorization. So if you have a matrix A that's, say, 50,000 by 50,000, 50,000 rows and 50,000 columns, it has 2.5 billion entries. But if A factors as the product of a 50,000 by 10 and a 10 by 50,000 matrix, then you've written those 2.5 billion numbers in terms of 1 million independent numbers. And the idea is that those 2.5 billion numbers aren't really independent. They're products and sums of just 1 million different numbers. And then let me make a comment about this notation that I'm using. So this notation is adopted from a collection of notation that I think if you wanted to Google it, you could look up tensor networks. So it's not uncommon to refer to a matrix with subscripts like Bij to be the element in the ith row in the jth column of B. So you can see that symbol has exactly the same content as this picture above it, which is a circle with the letter B in it, and an I decorating the left side and a J decorating the right side. And so this is a complete description of a matrix. And then this notation of contracting along an edge means that, so for each I and K, so for each choice of I and K, this picture represents one number. It's in the, you know, and which number is it? It's the sum over J. So I've summed over the contracted index, the Bij number and the Cjk number. And so this is just a visual depiction of matrix multiplication. You don't have to just have order 2 tensors. You could have 3-dimensional arrays that for every I, J, and K. And, you know, in this picture, you don't have to think in terms of rows and columns. You just have this picture to kind of keep track of what things are. And then I think there are some relations among tensors that can be depicted in a nice way using this sort of visual language. So a picture like this, on the right-hand side, this vertical line represents just the identity. And so here, if I've drawn B and B star, it's transpose. And I've written this equation. This equation wouldn't be true for any particular, you know, order 3 tensor, but it would indicate something about this tensor, that it's sort of, you know, unitary with respect to the left 2 indices, something like that. Okay, so this can bring me to the model class that I want to consider for functions on this very large Hilbert space. I'm not going to look at any function. I'm going to look at those functions that have a factorization into what's called a matrix product state, as pictured here. And so when I say a fixed bond space W, you can think of this as fixing an integer like 3 or 10, or you can think abstractly that this horizontal index is represented by this space W, or represents summing over a fixed number of indices, the bond dimension maybe 3 or 10. Okay. Any questions? Okay. You know, it's traditional in math talks for people to ask questions all the time. Yeah.
I guess, how do you know how you can actually, how certain tensors can be expressed in terms of those matrix products?
Right. So like if you go back to a picture like this, not every 50,000 by 50,000 matrix could be factored. You can see right away there are some necessary conditions. For example, to factor it as the product B times C in the way that's pictured here, the rank of A has to be at most 10. So that's a pretty serious restriction. If you pick 2.5 billion numbers randomly, generically speaking, the rank is going to be 50,000. But you know, what's interesting is it's not completely clear what kind of matrices, you know, can really be factored or approximately factored. It's a little hard to, I think it's I think it's an open problem to really study the space of tensors that can be factored into a matrix product state, especially when you're only care about doing it approximately, right? If you take the identity matrix, if you take the diagonal matrix that has 0.0001 on the diagonal all the way across, that's a full rank matrix. But in L2 norm, it's extremely close to one of, you know, very low rank. And so the matrices that can factor in this way fill up, you know, the space of all matrices in an obscure way. You know, I think of it as sort of, there's a lot of tendrils there, and they're close to a lot of full rank matrices, but it's not completely known. Let me move on, but it's an important point because it gets to the inductive bias of the machine learning problem that you may want to consider, whether this is a good model class or not. Okay, so this is the model class I want to talk about, are these tensors. So if you want to be explicit, think of this bond space as, think of this vertical space as being two-dimensional. So this would be something, this would represent a function on bit strings of length 7, which is a space of dimension 2 to the 7th, which I think is 128. Okay, so a lot smaller than 2 to the 1,000, but I need to be able to picture it, so I'm just picking 7. But if this bond space, say, were dimension 3, then the number of parameters for a factorized matrix product state like this would be, well, you'd have 6 parameters to describe the tensor on the left, and then you would have 3 times 2 times 3. So that's, what is 3 times 3 times 2? 18. So you have 18 here, and 18 here, 18 here, 18 here, 18 here, and 6 on the ends. I added this up. It's less than 128. But you can see that it's polynomial in the number of, in these 2 parameters, 2 and 3, whereas as the number of sites grows, the number of that grows exponentially. So it's a huge, many order of magnitude savings. Just like going from 2.5 billion to 1 million is 3 orders of magnitude. Okay, so in order to explain the machine learning problem and the algorithm that I'm going to talk about, I need to say something about mixed canonical form. So that's going to be an adjective I can describe to a particular matrix product state. But the point is that when you factorize something, factorizations are not unique. I mean, right? If you factorize the number 100, you can write it as 4 times 25, or you can write it as 8 times 12 and a half, right? So, and in general, if you have any invertible, you know, bond space by bond space matrix, you can insert it between B and C in a matrix factorization, and then I can just multiply B by M to make another matrix on the left, and M inverse times C to make another matrix on the right. So there's clearly, you know, there's some kind of a gauge group that acts on the factorizations here. Right, so this I wrote this at the lunch break because I realized that this would be hard to figure out. It's hard to explain otherwise. So, so I want to explain something called mixed canonical form. And so suppose I have two arbitrary tensors, I mean, of the order 2 like this and 3 like this, and I've contracted them here. What I can do is I can take the tensor on the left and do a singular value decomposition on it. So I've rewritten the tensor on the left. See, I've just copied over the tensor on the right. But the tensor on the left, I've written as sort of a unitary matrix times a diagonal matrix times another unitary matrix, or like U, D, V star, I think is the way people normally do it. And then what I can do is I can take the diagonal one and the V one and push them into the tensor on the right-hand side. So I've changed the color of it. I've turned it from purple to red or blue to red to indicate it's different now. And on the left-hand side, I have this unitary matrix. So, so this equal sign here indicates that the contracted tensor that obtained by contracting it, viewed as an object in the tensor space of these two vertical indices and this one horizontal one, it's the same as the one here. It's the same object, but it's factorized differently, and it's factorized so that the tensor on the left-hand side is unitary, so that if I were to glue it to its transpose in this way after this implication arrow, the green ones cancel out and give me the identity. So I just get a picture that involves the red one. So this is the idea behind mixed canonical form. So that what I can do is, if I have a matrix product state and I pick one site, I can, without changing the tensor that I have, but just changing the factors involved, I can make everything on the left sort of unitary on the left, so that if I multiply by the transpose, they become the identity. And everything on the right, I can do and push everything into this tensor in the middle, so that the ones on the right are unitary and will disappear when I compose them with their transpose. Okay, so I think this is a really, really nice idea. And now I want to describe DMRG. So those letters, DMRG, it's an acronym for the density matrix renormalization group procedure. This is an algorithm in computational quantum physics. It's usually used to describe the ground state of a Hamiltonian. It's adapted here to learn a function from some sampled data. So let me explain how it works. First, in really high level terms, suppose I have a function psi hat in this Hilbert space, which is the tensor product of many copies of a lower dimensional Hilbert space. And then I have an initial choice, could be just zeros, or it could be randomly selected, some initial matrix product state. I'm going to define a sequence of matrix product states. So this model class M represents matrix product states. I'm going to give you a sequence of matrix product states that will converge to this given target psi hat. And how do I do it? I'm going to do it inductively. And I'm going to get from one matrix product state to the next one by solving a little problem in an effective Hilbert space. And I'll say exactly what I mean in a moment. The base step, you choose some initial one, And then the inductive step is, suppose I have a matrix product state. From this matrix product state, I'm going to get an embedding of an effective Hilbert space. So this is just a small dimensional vector space. But the matrix product state psi sub t at the tth step is going to give me a particular embedding of this small effective Hilbert space in this large Hilbert space. And then I get this should say psi t plus 1, the next matrix product state to be the element in the image of this smaller dimensional embedded Hilbert space that's closest to my target. There are other algorithms that you could use. You could do like a little gradient step in this effective Hilbert space or something. But I think it's great to realize that because these are Hilbert spaces and you have an inner product, you can just do direct optimization by orthogonal projection. You don't need to do any kind of gradient descent. So it's a deterministic algorithm with guarantees on error terms. So here's the picture I have in mind. I drew this. This is like the large Hilbert space H. I drew it as a circle because in a lot of the applications I did it, everything were probability distributions. I was looking for unit vectors, but you don't have to think of it as a circle. So here's the objective, and here's my initial guess. Now this initial guess will determine, in a way I'll explain in a moment, a small, like 6-dimensional or 10-dimensional Hilbert space inside of this 2 to the 1,000 dimensional Hilbert space. And then in this small Hilbert space, it'll be mapped in isometrically, and then I'll get the next matrix product state to be the one in this small Hilbert space that's closest to the objective function. Yeah. And anyway, it doesn't matter. For any initial guess, we can define a sequence. Now, this next matrix product state, psi1, it determines an embedding of the same dimensional effective Hilbert space, but a different isometric embedding. So then I'll get this other isometric embedding of this like 6-dimensional Hilbert space in this 2 to the 1,000 dimensional space. And then there'll be a simple formula to just project the objective function onto this and find the closest point, psi2. And you can iterate this process and get a sequence that gets closer and closer to psi hat. And I really like this perspective. No physicist who explained DMRG to me ever explained it in what to me is such simple terms. Okay, so just a reminder of how this works. If I have a Hilbert space, call it H effective. So think of this as like a small 10-dimensional Hilbert space, and think of H as like 2 to the 1,000 dimensional. To have a linear map from H effective into H that's an isometric embedding, I just mean it preserves the inner product. So the inner product of, you have two elements in this effective Hilbert space, and their inner product is the same as when you map them over into the big space and take their inner product. And when you have an isometric embedding, it and its adjoint operator fit together in a diagram, that to me, I like this diagram because it reminds me, I'm a topologist, so it reminds me of like the situation you have with like a homotopy equivalence. But you have the map alpha going from the effective Hilbert space into H, and its adjoint going in the other direction. And if you start in the effective Hilbert space and you apply alpha and then the adjoint alpha star, that's just the identity on the effective Hilbert space. But if you start in the large Hilbert space and you map alpha down to the effective one, and then you map back into H, this is just an orthogonal projection from H onto the image of the effective Hilbert space. So that's the thing to keep in mind. The point is, when you have one of these embeddings alpha, it's easy to do orthogonal projection on the image of this, on the subspace, which is the image of the effective, just by applying alpha alpha star. So there's a formula. Okay, so how do I define the effective problem? Well, you'll pick a gauge site, like this. In this picture, I picked the third one. And then you put this MPS into mixed canonical gauge relative to that site. And then the effective Hilbert space, this will always be the effective Hilbert space. It's the bond space tensor 1 copy of the site space, tensor 1 copy of the bond space. So that's things that look like this object on the left. So if these bond spaces are 3 and the physical site has dimension 2, this is a little 18-dimensional vector space, 3, 3, and 2. And then you map it into this large Hilbert space by taking the MPS you started with, putting it in gauge canonical form relative to one site. You pull that site out and you replace it with any arbitrary site in your effective Hilbert space. So that gives you a map from this small vector space into this huge one. So you just replace one site. Okay, why is this an isometry? Right, it certainly doesn't look like one, but the reason this is an isometric embedding is because of the condition that the MPS was put into gauge canonical form, and I'm replacing that one site where I've pushed everything that's from the sides into that one site. So let's start on the right. If I have psi and psi tilde as this white tensor and this green tensor, their inner product happens when you just multiply one by the transpose of the other, and then take the trace over that. That's, denoted by this symbol. If you contract along these edges, you're just taking the sums of the squares of all the entries. Okay, so that's the inner product on the right. But what is alpha of phi? Remember, alpha says you just put the small tensor, this order 3 tensor, into the big MPS in the missing site. So when I apply alpha psi, I get this whole tensor on the right-hand side. And when I take alpha psi prime, I get this long MPS on the bottom. And when I contract them, I get this huge sum, but because of the gauge canonical form, everything on the left becomes the identity, everything on the right becomes the identity. And so you get the same picture that you had on the right. And so that's how you get that it's an isometric embedding.
But then if you make them kind of perform, then the ones become different, right?
Well, so what is this map? I take this MPS. So this is given. I put it in gauge canonical form. That changes the individual terms in the factorization, or the factors in the factorization, but it doesn't change the tensor. So yeah. So I put it in gauge canonical form here, and then I remove the site at which I centered my gauge canonical form. And then I have an MPS with a missing tensor. And then if I have any little 3 tensor at all in this vector space, I can just plug it in. And that gives me a map from going from this small vector space into the large one. And because of the preparation, that map is an isometry. What's the adjoint map look like? Well, the adjoint map goes from this huge vector space, V tensor N, back down to the small vector space. And that has a nice, clean graphical depiction too. So an arbitrary tensor in this large Hilbert space H, these capital N copies of V, I'm going to denote by this pink blob, which just means it's a number for every possible choice of index on the bottom. And then now I need to get something that has 3 indices, 2 bond indices and 1 physical index. And how do I do it? Well, I use the MPS I have with its piece removed, and I just plug it on. Now what's left are 3 open indices. So while it's a funny way to draw it, this is just a 3 tensor because I'm contracting and summing over everything else. And I'm just left with 3 open indices. So this is really could be refashioned as just a blob with 3 legs coming out. And I claim this is the adjoint. What's the proof? Well, to check that it's an adjoint, I have to take eta is a tensor in the large Hilbert space. Phi is a tensor in the small Hilbert space. And so what does the inner product of eta with alpha of phi? Well, remember what alpha of phi is. So eta is this pink blob on the top. Phi is just this little yellow tensor. Alpha of phi is what happens when I put this yellow tensor into the MPS. And then when I contract, I get the inner product. So I just explained the equal sign on the left. What about the equal sign on the right? Well, what is alpha star of eta? That's what happens when I take eta as this pink blob, and alpha star of it is I attach all of these blue tensors to it. So it's what happens without the yellow blob. So alpha star of psi is everything except the yellow. And then to take the inner product with phi means put the yellow one in. And you see they're the same picture. So so there you go. Okay, now let's look at psi hat. So this is some objective function. How is it defined? It's an element in this vector space, so it's a bunch of numbers times the points xi. So if you want to think of this as being like in traditional machine learning, I give you some data points x's, and then I give you the functional value, these, you know, the yi's or something, the labels. So here I'm just putting the y values in front and the x values here, and I'm taking the sum. So this is a description of this function. Now, how do I find the point in this effective 3-dimensional Hilbert space embedded inside this large space? I just apply alpha star. These are linear maps. So it breaks down into really 2 little pieces. One is I pull these constants out, and then I have this alpha star xi term. So I'll tell you how to compute that. And then afterwards, I'll tell you how to compute alpha of it. And so this gives you a way of, without having access to psi hat, really, in this large 2 to the 1000 dimensional Hilbert space, I can still compute its orthogonal projection on this small subspace. So how does this alpha star of xi work? Well, remember, this is the map alpha star. So xi will be one of these pink blobs, and I'll just attach it to the MPS like this. So if xi is a particular sequence, I just put in those numbers or those elements from my alphabet, and then I get a tensor like this, which has 3 open indices, which is a little 3 tensor. I've drawn it in this light yellow color. So that's one term like this. To get all of them, I just multiply them by these y values like this. This is one alpha star of xi is a little 3 tensor like this, and then I multiply it by a y value, and I sum over all of these data points. So this is a sum over the data, and it gives me one 3 tensor like this. And then what's the next thing I have to do? That's everything inside the sum. I just need to apply alpha to it. So after I finally get this 3 tensor, I take the old MPS I had, and I put that in the missing spot. And then this is the closest vector in the MPS, in this deterministic formula, no gradient steps. When you do this to find the ground state of a Hamiltonian, there's usually a little gradient step here, but this is completely deterministic. So this was your psi t, and this is your psi t plus 1. And then what you do is you just iterate. You move to the next site and do it again. You move to the next site and do it again. And that gives you your sequence of M matrix product states. So this was the picture. Let me describe it in terms of the ideas that I just described. So psi t is a matrix product state. I'm at some step in my algorithm. And so I have one of my sites there. I now look at this effective Hilbert space. This is all the MPS, all the functions in this huge Hilbert space that have an MPS factorization where all the tensors are the same as the psi t tensor, except for one. And then I can put anything I want in that one spot, and that gives me a little small dimensional Hilbert space. And then you just use your data to figure out how to replace that tensor to get the point that's closest. This algorithm is, well, for one thing, I didn't write it here, but it's deterministic. There's no gradient descents. It is provably your steps are productive. And it's linear both in the number of training examples and in the number of sites. It's also parallelizable in a way that can make it log in the number of sites. So it can, with unlimited hardware, be exponentially faster than, say, a transformer. So let me point out a couple of features of it. They have an interesting inductive bias. So what kind of functions actually have this sort of low rank factorization? It's the question you asked earlier. There's in terms of a quantum physicist who is viewing these as the ground states of one-dimensional quantum systems would say something in terms of the entanglement entropy of the system, and that's sort of correlated to the mutual information over distances in your data. It's a little bit hard to say really explicitly, but I can give you some examples. Also, the algorithm's interpretable. It's deterministic. I know what it does at every step. It's not a black box. It's linear algebra. And at the end, there's a perfect sampling algorithm. If I've learned a probability distribution, there's a perfect sampling algorithm. You don't have to do Monte Carlo or anything. I can just sample directly from the actual distribution defined by this function. There's a great thing called perfect sampling for unitary tensor networks by Guy Vidal and some co-authors from about, 8 or 10 years ago. And it's extremely fast and efficient. So here's one example where I think the inductive bias really shows off. So here's an experiment where I work with the parity data set. This is pretty small, sorry about that. The parity data set, you take, what is this data set? It's bit strings of length 20 that have an even number of ones in them. So you've got a sequence of 20 zeros and ones. There's like, 1 million of them. You look at the subset that have an even number of ones. So there's half of them, that's half of them. And what you do is you try to learn the function that is the probability distribution uniformly concentrated on the even parity ones. So you want to produce a generative model that when you samples uniformly all the even parity bit strings. So this is an interesting problem because it's extremely frustrating for things like LSTMs or recurrent neural networks to learn this data set, because there's no information in the conditional probabilities. If I give you my bit string up to position 16, it gives you no information about what the 17th character is. It could be anything. It's sort of involves correlations over the entire thing with no conditional information. So for a while, this was the number one open unsolved problem on OpenAI's list of most important unsolved problems in machine learning, was to learn this data set. And you can learn it with a matrix products set. This is actually a copy from TensorBoard. You just, in sort of 20 discrete steps of replacing this tensor, you learn it absolutely perfectly. This log loss is, to get a log loss of 19, it is the uniform distribution on 2 to the 19th elements, with no errors at all. So this is a paper I wrote with James Stokes, who's at the University of Michigan. And so I think this was great because we trained with 2% of the data set and we learned it immediately. And I know of no other model that can learn this data set. There's other interesting data sets like Div7. This is just one we made up. It's also in the same paper. Because bit string sort of, while it was stated as one of the important problems in OpenAI's list, it wasn't, it's not impressive to human beings because you just count the number of ones, and if they're even, it's an even bit string and it's sort of easy to solve just visually. But Div7 is, I give you a 20-digit number that's divisible by 7. That's not so easy to just look at and see. But if you just give it a small percentage, you can train the model and it will, produce the uniform distribution on numbers divisible by 7. You give it a few examples, it learns them, you sample from your function at the end, and it samples from all numbers that are divisible by 7, not just the other ones. So the inductive bias generalizes really perfectly for problems like this. The Tomita languages are not English. They're languages of interest to linguists, but they're these matrix product states learn these languages well too. They're like, you can look at them. They're simple languages, but they, some are context free, some are context dependent. Other data sets. Let me add something about it being interpretable. This was a different paper that I wrote with Ty Dene Bradley and Miles Studenmeyer. Miles, some of you know, he's a computational quantum physicist at Flatiron. We used a slightly different training algorithm, but what this is a picture of is this blue curve is because this is an interpretable algorithm. We just went in and we said, okay, theoretically, how well will we learn it if we use X% of the data set as training data? So we just looked in, we interpreted some eigen vectors, and we just analyzed the situation, and we came up with this blue curve as a theoretical prediction for how well the model would train given a certain fraction of samples from the training data. And then the orange curve is a summary of a bunch of, many thousands of experiments, which are the gray dots. And it was really like, if you zoom in on this curve, especially like once you get past a certain point, I was really proud that we were able to like theoretically predict this. I don't think you can say, given this percentage of samples from CFAR 10 or something, how well is your particular convolutional neural network going to learn it? What's the generalization error going to be, or anything like this? I mean, I don't know of any good bounds like that. This is a picture of Miles and Ty, the co-authors on this paper. From the Simon Center, they liked this paper and they did a video in their Quantum Connect about it. I wasn't there, but they were there. Anyway, so as the last talk of the day, I think it's appropriate to end early. But I'd be happy to take questions if you have any. Yes.
So I'm sure you're going to tell me that this is a tried and failed, but I'll ask it anyway. So, I mean, in terms of understanding these matrix products, is there anything that you can expose about them, about the, these matrices through transformations, potential to be transformed through similarity transformation things? Has it been tried? Does it reveal anything about how obvious the factorization is, or something like that?
Well, I'm not sure about transformations, but I've thought about what kind of matrices or tensors have matrix product state factorizations or can be well approximated by them. And I don't really have any insights. I don't think I have any really good insights about what kind of
could you look for a transformation by saying, okay, I'm going to somehow insist that something be factorizable?
Oh, yeah.
And then say, okay, now I try to find a transformation. If I can, okay, then, maybe I learned that this is factorizable, or if I can't, I don't know if that can be done, but there's a way to sort of search through possible transformation of the concept.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the algorithm that in fact that's the one that this slide was about was a slightly different version of DMRG that involved one pass. You just one pass, you just start on the left, you change your tensors, you get to the end, and then you have something that's the best MPS approximation to what you started. And what you started with was basically just the sum of the training examples, sort of evenly weighted. Now, in general, if you take, let's say 20,000 vectors and you just randomly, and you form their superposition, that will be generically a rank 20,000 operator. And then what that will do is that memorizes your training set if you actually write down that rank 20,000 operator. But what you realize is that the actual data set of these parity to even parity training samples, when you sum over all of them, turns out to be suddenly low rank and have this low rank factorization. And so, if you want to think of it in a way, is if you think of it in a kind of engineering way of like the MPS transferring information from the left to the right, if you put these bits in one at a time, the only thing it really needs to transfer along the bond is the sum of the parity so far. And so that kind of gives you the intuition that it should have this low rank factorization. And so what ends up happening is you have the sum of the training data is like this high rank thing that's really far outside your model class. But when you start to try and approximate it within the low rank, you actually don't get that close to that rank 20,000 data set. But what you end up doing is finding the best MPS approximation for it, which is really the idealized one that characterizes what you want. And I think that goes back to your question at the beginning, Alexi, about what's really going on. and I think this ought to be a good NLP model as well. Of course, there are fancier tensor networks than matrix product states as well. But
more questions. We have good amount of time for questions.
I sort of assume that you asked me to talk about this because there are people using tensor networks in problems related to molecules. I don't know about molecules though. So I don't know how, I can't say anything smart about those methods, but I've heard it talked around in sort of like molecule discovery or some other problems, like that. Anyway, I'd be curious if anyone knows.
Yeah, I guess in the end, I mean, whether they are molecules or not, so a lot of situations we actually deal with actual quantum states.
Yeah.
And so like things that Alexei talked about, so the reduced density matrices are actually the reduced representation of excited states. So you have, for example, a few molecules, then sometimes you can have one molecule being electronically excited, but you can also have linear combination of those things. So they actually form reduced density matrix elements. And then all other degrees of freedom are also, they also can be represented in principle by so many quantum states. So definitely, actually, what you said is true. There are many quantum chemists and also some quantum physicists who use this, the tensor network approach or matrix product states a lot, and this seems to be actually quite trendy one. Although, I mean, I've been to the Flatiron Institute workshop 2 weeks ago, and then actually talked with Miles about that. And then there are many good quantum physicists working on that. Still, but I couldn't really figure out all those details. Your talk today actually clarified a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
I was
great.
actually, I mean, just to sort
Yeah.
of build on that a little
Yeah.
bit. I mean, I've never seen DFRG described in this way, but I think the way that you describe it is just tremendously clear. And actually like a really neat perspective on how to do it. I mean, is there sort of like a write-up that you've done?
It's
Just kind of talking about the DFRG, in this diagrammatic approach.
So-
I think that would be really fun for teaching students too.
yeah, so this picture and some it is in the paper that it published in Entropy, yeah, with James. And I think we thought that one of the contributions of that paper was, I mean, no one had used matrix product states to do generative sequence modeling. And so that was like a contribution. We also had but we thought that this presentation was also a contribution, just explaining it in this way. And one thing about reduced densities that I think is worth pointing out, if you take if you think of psi, your MPS, as being the state of your quantum system, like as a many body system where each site is a particle, then what you can do is you can form the reduced density that describes the subsystem at, say, one site by just taking the contraction of this with itself. So you would just do this, except instead of contracting this white index and the green index, you would just leave it open. And that would be a physical site by physical site matrix, which would be the reduced density. And then there's this interesting theorem, that I'm sure has an analog in physics. I don't know what the name is, but you can prove that if you start with a pure state and you form the reduced density, that you can reconstruct the whole state from the reduced density. Because the original state from the reduced density. And I mean, I think the quantum physics idea is that a pure state is the one that is most maximally entangled, right? It has, like, for a given fixed entanglement entropy, the pure state has, von Neumann entropy 0, but it's the maximally entangled one. And so what the reduced density at one site knows everything about the environment. I mean, that's not true if you started with a mixed state, and then there's this question about if you have degenerate repeated eigenvectors, degenerate eigenvalues and repeated eigenvectors, there's a caveat, but generically speaking, you can reconstruct the original one. And so I think this is an interesting from a data perspective, because if you think about language, for instance, it really is saying that, what one word, for example, if you think about this in NLP, what one word, the subsystem that describes one word is really just, dual to the system of all the sentences that it can fit into. And I feel like that's a really appealing, is a really appealing idea, and could provide like really much more beautiful word embeddings than the ones that are obtained from like Word2Vec, because if you think about how Word2Vec works, or you can think of something that understands every sentence that a word is in as its meaning. It's of course not a vector, it's a reduced density, but that's even better because it's not just a collection of 700 numbers, but it's something structured. It has a spectrum, it has all kinds of other things.
And yeah, also actually you can, if you want, you can also ask questions to anyone who
Yeah.
they talk today. Yeah, there are some additional questions to ask. Yeah. So,
I'm gonna-
what's your machine learning.
By the way, I reran the experiments for P20.
Yeah.
Oh, am I showing this? I am showing this, but I'm not sharing this. Okay, fine. Let me okay, I turned my mic off too. Okay. I reran the experiments, and they run really fast. Like for P20 on my laptop without even being plugged into a power source, it took 1 minute and 23 seconds to run 20 DMRG sweeps, and you can see I'm running I'm running the sampling algorithm in my training just for fun. So I'm sampling 50 samples, and you can see at the beginning I get 26 right. That's because it's 50-50, it's just random. And then you can see it's sort of still random, and then boom, it figures it out, and then gets correct. But like even running the sampling algorithm in the middle of your training algorithm, it's like 1 minute. of wall clock. So I think for certain things, it's a pretty good, and then I tried to make a histogram, but it's like, it's sort of too good for a histogram because every one is 10 to the minus 6, right? That's 1 over 2 to the 19th. And that's the probability of every even one. And the odd ones just aren't even on here, even if you go down to 10 to the minus 12. So it's not a very interesting histogram, but anyway.
So in general, why does DMLG work when it works? Is it because of the low dimensionality that you are able to repeat them?
Well, if you have some reason to think that your data can be represented by a vector in a super high dimensional vector with a low rank factorization, then I think it's going to work well. You can also train an MPS by doing gradient descent on the whole thing. This is something that Jacob Miller, who was at Mila in Quebec, was doing a lot of. He wrote PyTorch libraries for matrix product states with gradient descent. And, I like DMRG. I like this version of DMRG with the data because I think it's so great that it's just deterministic. The way physicists usually do it for the ground state is what they do is they take out a site and then they just optimize in the site space by doing a gradient descent in this small space to figure out what would be a better tensor to put in there to reduce the energy. And then you go to the next site and you go to the next site. And sometimes you do this in 2 sites, which is kind of nice because if you fuse 2 sites together, it's like you leave the model class a little bit and then you do some optimization there. And then there's a way to go back to the model class when you split it. So that's appealing from a machine learning perspective because it's like, instead of crawling around this parameter space, you're able to leap through extra dimensions. I wanted that idea to be the one that worked best, but I found that this single site where you just know the answer by putting in your data, changing the coefficient, and then replacing it was good. And it also takes advantage of a lot of efficiencies, because when you put your data in here at one step, a lot of those things are the same as when you go to the next step and you put your data in. So you're able to reuse almost all of your previous computations. And then when you schedule by updating at one site, updating at the next site, updating at the next site, you don't have to re-gauge much. So that's really efficient too. So so there's some extra efficiencies that you can take advantage of.
Yeah, and also I heard that kind of the main benefit of matrix product studies to use a singular value decomposition to reduce the dimensionality. Is there any other does it always work?
Well, there's no doubt that singular value decompositions are a valuable tool in a lot of places, right? Yeah. If you just think of principal component analysis, or in one of the previous talks about finding, what are your parameters you want to be looking at. I think and if you think of one matrix product state as a sequence of compatible singular value decompositions, that's the way I would think about it. So if you imagine taking, let me put this picture up. So forget the color and the things on the outside. If I find the MPS that fits onto an arbitrary tensor. And maximizes that inner product. So that would be the one that is as close as possible to the given tensor, given the constraint that it has to factor this way. Then you can think of the MPS as having been obtained from the tensor up above by some sequence of compatible singular value decompositions. So I think if I just made it 2 onto 2, I think that would be clear, because what I'm saying is I want to factor a matrix into a product. And if I fix this rank to be 10, the best way to factor one matrix into the best way to factor a matrix into one that's the product of 2 whose intermediate dimension is 10 is to do a singular value decomposition on the big one, throw out all but the top 10 singular values. And it's not hard to prove that that's the one that's closest, because the L2 norm is invariant under unitary transformations. And so its norm is just the same as the sum of its eigenvalues or their squares or something, and then getting rid of the smallest ones proves that. And then just a repeated argument like that tells you that this MPS is. So a successfully learned MPS can be thought of as like some sequence of compatible SVDs. And so I think that that's a perspective that's like, it's another reason I think it could make a good natural language model. Because you get, Word2Vec is obtained through a neural process that seems a little bit like a black box. But there's a great paper that explains that if you just take the matrix that's words by words with mutual information learned from the corpus, and you do a low rank factorization of it, that is the 2 layers that's learned by the Word2Vec algorithm, the Mikolov algorithm. So it's a neural network, but what it's really doing is an SVD on a particularly interesting linguistic matrix. And so if you think of word by word by word by word by word, and you do something like this, it's got to be like, a souped up version of that. But are molecules like languages? I'm not sure.
They're not dissimilar, right? I mean, just
Our understanding of molecules may not be that different from the things related to language. If you maybe, trust Wittgenstein.
Yeah, well, I do. I like Wittgenstein's use theory of meaning. What's the meaning of a word?
Yeah.
In terms of its reduced density, literally also knows its all of its uses.
Okay.
So I feel like that's a very Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Is that what you said, Wittgenstein?
Yeah, Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we pretty much you have talked a lot,
Okay.
and you can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll unplug now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it might have been difficult for you to talk to different targets. Yeah.
Well,
we learned a lot actually. Yeah.
Okay, I hope it was useful.
Yeah, that's
I didn't want it to be too long in case it wasn't.
Yeah.